Today we're going to start a new section on human anatomy and biology. And we will start this section with a review of various general aspects of human biology. This will include a quick overview of the 11 various systems that the body has, as well as beginning to talk about the various tissue types that make up the human body. So when we talk about the body cavities, this diagram shows you the various cavities that are present in the body. The first of these is the cranial cavity. The cranial cavity is where the brain resides. The brain stem is also in the cranial cavity. And then the spinal cavity, which is where the spinal cord is. There is no physical delineation between the cranial and the spinal cavity, although things get pretty tight right in this area when it passes down from the medulla into the spinal cord. The thoracic cavity is where the lungs and the heart reside, which is divided anatomically from the abdominal pelvic cavity by the diaphragm. So the abdominal pelvic cavity is shown here. The pelvis has no division to delineate it from the abdominal cavity, and so these two cavities are contiguous with each other. And inside these cavities there's something called the viscera. Viscera is just a general term to talk about the internal organs. So when we talk about systems, what are we talking about? A system is a group of structures that function together and they serve a single purpose. An example of a system is the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system serves one purpose, which is to transport blood around the body. The blood is transported around the body in order to transport oxygen and remove carbon dioxide from the body. Organs are the smaller parts of a system. For example, the heart is one of the organs that make up the cardiovascular system. Tissues are an even smaller part of an organ. So muscle tissue, specifically cardiac muscle tissue, is one of the tissues that make up the heart. And then cells are the fundamental units of a tissue. And again, cardiac muscle is made up of cardiac cells or cardiac muscle cells. So as I said, the various systems are made up each individually in order to perform a function. And this is just an example. I am not going to go through this diagram today because we will go through this diagram in detail when we talk about the cardiovascular system in detail. The function of the cardiovascular system is to circulate blood throughout the body, and the blood acts to deliver oxygen to the tissues, to remove carbon dioxide from the tissues, and to also transport various other things such as immune cells, nutrients, etc. throughout the body. The immune system is a system that's made up and whose primary function is to protect the body from foreign invaders. Now, by foreign invaders, we don't just mean microbes. We also mean foreign tissue, foreign cells. The immune system is responsible, for example, for transplant rejection. So when you transplant an organ from another person into a body, the immune system is what you have to worry about rejecting that transplantation. The respiratory system is responsible for bringing oxygen into the body and transferring it into the blood, and for removing carbon dioxide from the body, which is transported by the blood to the lungs and then ultimately is breathed out when the person breathes. The digestive system has two functions. The first is to break down food. That's what digestion means. And then the second is for the absorption of nutrients. And so there's two fundamental functions of the digestive system: the breakdown of food into molecules and substances that can be absorbed, and then the subsequent absorption of those nutrients. ultimately some amount of the food is then eliminated through the bowel. The excretory system is responsible for removing liquid waste from the body. The liquid waste is transported through the blood to the kidneys, and the kidneys filter out the waste products that are in the blood. And then this is put into the urine. The urine then passes through the ureters into the urinary bladder, where it's subsequently expelled from the body. The nervous system is responsible for coordinating activities in the body. The endocrine system regulates body activities. The nervous system and the endocrine system have two similar purposes, regulating body activity. But the endocrine system acts much more slowly through the use of chemicals called hormones, whereas the nervous system acts much more quickly, primarily through chemicals known as neurotransmitters. The integumentary system is the skin and skin appendages, and this is the barrier between the outside world and the body, as well as gives the body the ability to communicate with the outside world. The skeletal system functions to support the body as well as protecting the internal organs of the body. And then the muscular system is responsible for movement. This movement is both voluntary, like when we walk or move our arms or turn our heads, as well as involuntary, such as the movement that occurs within our digestive tract in order to move food down the digestive tract. And then finally, the reproductive system functions to allow for the continuation of the human species. With that summary of the 11 systems, one of the fundamental principles is something called homeostasis, and we've talked about this some time ago. But again, it's an important concept that cannot be forgotten. And homeostasis is the process where a stable internal environment is maintained. And this is achieved through something called feedback mechanisms. A feedback mechanism is something that detects a change and then initiates a response. And so what it means by feedback is there's a sensory input, and this feeds into the brain and into various other parts of the body, and then it causes a response, a chemical or a neurologic response, which is initiated by the original change. And so you have what's known as a set point, which is where a certain value is supposed to be. Let's say your blood sugar. And when this changes, the body detects the change in your blood sugar, and then a response in the body is initiated, and the response occurs to restore the signal back to its normal position. Now, there are two kinds of feedback. There's what's known as negative feedback, which is far more common. Negative feedback basically reverses the change in effect. What that means is if your blood sugar goes up, the body detects it, and whatever response occurs is to bring it back down. And so it reverses the elevation of your blood sugar and brings it back down to where it's supposed to be. The other type is called positive, and positive is extremely uncommon, actually. And what that does is it increases the effect of the change. One example is the immune system. Sometimes when you trigger the immune system in certain ways, there's a positive feedback, which there's actually both a positive and a negative feedback. Initially, there's a positive feedback which revs up the immune system in order for it to respond more vigorously as time passes. And then at the same time, there's also a negative effect in order to shut the immune system down over a period of time so that it doesn't get out of control. Now let's talk for just a minute about tissues. There are actually 4 tissue types which make up the body. The first of these tissue types is called the muscle tissue. And muscle tissue has the fundamental and primary function of initiating movement within the body. And it's obviously part of the muscular system. is also part of the cardiac system as well as the digestive tract, where movement has to occur. The second of these tissues is the nervous tissue or nerve tissues. The nervous tissue conducts electrical signals throughout the body, and it makes up the nervous system. The third of these is epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is all over the body. It functions to cover, protect, in some cases to secrete, and also in some cases to regulate. For example, the epithelial tissue can secrete oil that goes on your skin and makes the skin more flexible and pliable and moist so that it doesn't crack and dry out. It can secrete sweat or perspiration, which also lubricates but fundamentally works to regulate the body temperature. And so in addition to the general protection that we see, you also have the covering effect of the tissue. And then lastly, the connective tissue. And the connective tissue is all throughout the body, and its purpose is to hold things together and to hold parts of one. It'll hold epithelial tissue where it's supposed to be. It holds bones together. You find it everywhere, and its fundamental function is to hold things together. And between all this is interstitial fluid. And interstitial fluid within the body acts to lubricate the body so that surfaces can pass over each other without friction or other disturbances. Within the body, there are multiple membranes. Now, when I talk about membranes here, I'm not talking about the surface membranes on a cell. What I am talking about are the thin, flexible sheets of tissue that are on the inside surfaces of the body, and in some cases on the outside surfaces, or within surfaces that are exposed to the outside. So for example, we have the serous linings or the serous membranes, and these line the inner parts of these various cavities that we went over. For example, we have the thoracic cavity, which has what's called a pleural lining, or the pleura, and the pleura is a serous lining that encloses this cavity. The peritoneal lining or peritoneal cavity or peritoneal membrane covers the abdominal and pelvic cavity, etc. The second of these is the mucous membranes, and you've heard that term mucous membrane. Mucous membranes are within the oral cavity, in the nasal cavity, and so these are line openings that extend to the outside of the body. The third is the cutaneous membrane, and in humans this is called the skin. And then there are the synovial membranes, and the synovial membranes line certain joint cavities, for example, the knee cavity. Cells and matrix. Let's talk about the matrix. The matrix is a non-living material that surrounds the cells. Plasma, for example, is a matrix that's within the blood that surrounds the red blood cells as they're being transported through the blood vessels. Now, one other concept I want to end with is the concept of vestigial organs. You'll hear this from time to time, particularly from evolutionary biologists. And a vestigial organ is an organ that does not seem to serve any useful purpose today. Now, an example of this is the appendix. Basically, most people do not believe that the appendix has a use. But what is true, at least from my perspective, is that there are no real vestigial organs. Only organs that we don't fully understand or don't know why they were necessary at the time of creation. And so we have all these various cells. This is an egg cell, a sperm cell. These are cartilage cells. Cartilage cells are part of the connective tissue. The nerve cells make up the nervous system. The blood cells, which are actually felt to be epithelial cells within the bloodstream, skin cells, muscle cells, bone cells, and fat cells. So one of the interesting things about cells, when you look at them, is number one, they're very different from each other. And number two, their differences really reflect their function. if you look at the nerve cell clearly looks like an electrical wire or an electrical cable. The fat cell is just a big glob where energy can be stored. The skin cells on the outside of the skin act as a protectant, etc.